Good evening, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Tonight, I figured I would make a quick video going over the new warrior changes coming up in Shadowlands and just give my general opinions and feedback, I suppose, on what's coming forward. And to start things off with, they finally did it. After all the feedback that they've gotten for the last 2 years, probably in BFA, Blizzard decided to finally change Arms' mastery to something a little bit different than old Deep Wounds. This one's kind of like a mix between something from like Warlords of Draenor, I'd say, and maybe even Mop Deep Wounds, being that it's now going to be a bleed, and then enemies take damage or increase damage, from you for anything that has this bleed on it. Another thing that you should note is that the duration has been doubled from 6 to 12 seconds, and this is extremely relevant for a lot of cases, for an arms warrior. But also, they removed Execute as an applicator, which it's here nor there for me. I get why a lot of people don't like the current rotation in Execute phase of just like spamming Execute basically in between, overpower procs and keeping Mortal Strike relevant during the last 20%. Like I said, it's a nice change, I guess. It keeps the rotation more interesting. It's not that big of a deal to me, but it is what it is. The next point is the mastery rating will increase the damage taken from you rather than the actual bleed itself. I do agree that Arms is nice to have a bleed in the kit, and right now on the alpha, I believe the damage of the bleed itself is like 60% of your AP or whatever, so it's not like a lot of damage in and of itself, and they can always adjust that accordingly if, they feel it's too low or whatever. But the damage taken effect, I think the baseline is like 9%, and then the more mastery rating you get will obviously scale that up. I do want to say, from like a feedback point of view, that the scaling on the new mastery has to be better than just flat versatility, because otherwise, why would you ever want mastery over versatility, since you're getting a defensive benefit from versatility as well? I imagine, they're fully aware of that. I just wanted to point it out that hopefully the mastery scaling is pretty good. So, we're getting, from 9 baseline to like 20%, at the start of the expansion or something like that. That way, all your other spells are hitting harder by anything that's bleeding as well. And it makes sense thematically to me as well that you would be, just compounding pressure on anything that would be bleeding. And moving on to the next point, execute damage has been increased by 20%. This is a great change. Obviously, I mean, who's going to complain about a buff? But specifically, like, execute has hit like a wet noodle for far too long now, so I really like that. Mortal Strike damage. Oh, and on the execute thing, this actually, I assume this is going to be directly benefiting the Venthyr Covenant ability, Condemn, since it's replacing Execute. I would assume it's also getting buffed by 20%, which is interesting, since it's doing shadow damage. It's going to make that, ability that much more powerful, I guess, especially if, it pairs up with Massacre going forward. The more I see of it, the more I don't really want to play with the Necrolord banner, and that's a whole other can of worms story about the balancing behind that thing. But yeah, this makes the Venthyr Covenant even more attractive. Mortal Strike damage has been reduced by 5%. This is whatever. I'm sure it's just a balancing thing. They're probably just offsetting the damage since your mastery is going to make you do, like 9% more. So technically it's a little bit higher, but at the moment it just seems kind of unnecessary, I suppose, because as that we're doing more damage because of our new mastery on like single target things especially, I would rather them take off this damage from Slam, Overpower, Skull Splitter, things like that, rather than Mortal Strike. I like having the big hits of Mortal Strike and Execute. Those are the two kind of core things for me. That's my opinion anyway. Ravager has been redesigned once again, and it replaces Blade Storm when it's talented, and once again inflicts deep wounds. The cooldown has been reduced to 45 seconds, and the duration is 12 seconds, still reduced by haste. And now it chases things, and this is funny, but it's very slow on the alpha right now anyway. Maybe they'll speed it up, and it'll be more useful for like high mobility targets. It's nice that it chases, but it's not that big of a deal. The big thing, is that it is a 45-second cooldown, which lines up perfectly with Warbreaker if you take that talent. And it lasts 12 seconds. And the debuff of deep wounds is 12 seconds. So, like, obviously it's reduced by haste, so it's not going to be quite like this. But you're getting 24 to, like, 20 seconds of deep wounds uptime, which is a long time. And that's great. And especially since you know, Warbreaker is going to be covering, like, is it 10, 12 second window of Colossus Smash. You could drop Ravager first just to put up deep wounds and get that extra bleed debuff on everything before you even Warbreaker, you know, just so you're hitting that Warbreaker, you know, 10% harder or whatever, and, you know, continue to do your rotation. Now, it doesn't mention here that it still generates rage, but down below there's some prot things, and I assume it's still going to generate like 7 rage per second, or 2 seconds. They might have changed that now. So that'll be great. It appears that it's taking every 2 seconds now, not every second like Bladestorm would. Whether or not it'll end up being better than Anger Management remains to be seen, but I could definitely see it getting some use in Mythic Plus or any, you know, heavy AoE fights. I like this change. Collateral damage has been redesigned once again. It no longer just refunds rage. When Sweeping Strikes ends, your next Whirlwind deals 25% increased damage for each ability used during Sweeping Strikes that damaged a second target. So Sweeping Strikes is getting its duration buff to like 15 seconds, unless that changes in Shadowlands. So, you know, theoretically you could get, you know, like 15 different spells off, you know, and if you have a ton of haste, maybe even more than that to get this big whirlwind at the end of collateral or your Sweeping Strikes window. It's interesting. Whirlwind's nice, I guess. It's an interesting choice of spell. I guess you'll always have it, so it's always going to see value rather than like Bladestorm or something silly. But Whirlwind doesn't hit hard to begin with, right? So it's, I don't know how good this will actually end up being. Maybe you could do something really cheesy where you stack up a giant Whirlwind buff and then Avatar and Colossus Smash somebody and try to Whirlwind them. The way I see it playing out like practicality is that you would Sweeping Strikes. The problem with this is that like 15 seconds to cleave something is a long time. Where in a lot of situations or in a dungeon or whatever, like everything's going to be dead by the time Sweeping Strikes is over anyway. Obviously not in a raid encounter, but if you're hitting 2 like bosses, for example, or whatever, you could do this, get this fat buff, and you would have Mortal Strike, because you're Sweeping Strikes, you would have the Deep Wounds debuff on 2 targets, which, you know, would allow you to Whirlwind right after for the extra damage bonus on everything. Another thing I wanted to point out with Sweeping Strikes and the new Mortal Strike is that since the bleed is lasting 12 seconds now, and Mortal Strike has a 6-second cooldown that's already reduced by haste, you could get, with Sweeping Strikes up, you could get Deep Wounds on 4 targets, like, permanently, just tabbing between, you know, 2 different things, and potentially even more if you've got, like, really low cooldowns on Mortal Strikes because of legendaries or whatever things that are coming. So this is, you know, an easy way to spread it alongside Bladestorm or Ravager. And that brings me to the last talent change for arms here, being Cleave. Cleave has been redesigned once again, and it replaces Sweeping Strikes. It just costs 20 rage on a 6-second cooldown, striking up to 5 enemies in front of you, inflicting deep wounds, and it also consumes Overpower like Mortal Strike to deal increased damage. Now currently it doesn't hit very hard. Once again, I want to say it's like 60% AP or something. Obviously it's getting buffed, but it doesn't hit as hard as it did before. You're just applying deep wounds to 5 targets on a 6-second cooldown. The problem with this is that it replacing Sweeping Strikes, like what is it actually buffing? Whirlwind is basically it currently, because you can't cleave Mortal Strike anymore or execute or anything. So I'm kind of failing to see the point of this spell, or this current iteration of it, because collateral damage is going to cover 2 target set areas better, and like mass AoE, where like in a dungeon where a lot of things don't live that long, Warbreaker and even Ravager or Bladestorm is applying deep wounds to everything anyway. I suppose in like super long-term AoE situations, yeah, you would light cleave just to have the consistent bleed of deep wounds, but if deep wounds itself isn't doing that much damage, like I said, I'm not really sure how good this will end up being. I kind of like the old version better, where it just hit really hard and then put up deep wounds on everything. But you know, we'll see. It was really expensive having the whirlwind everything and then cleave. You know, this one's just kind of remains to be seen, but I would think that this one might be the clunkier of the new options. Anyway, I spent too much time on arms, but I can't help it. Moving on to Fury. Single-minded Fury's back, giving you 8% increased damage and movement speed by 5%. It's kind of odd little balancing thing. This is here nor there for me. I mean, I'm glad it's back, don't get me wrong, but as far as it mechanically being back, I don't really care. It would have been just as easy to have it as transmog. That way you don't have all the balance concerns. You could make something funny with like this 8% damage buff. Perhaps like a Dragon Roar would hit harder with it, especially coming down to that later. Or like the Spear of Bastion, maybe. Like the percentage base damage would be better scaling than just raw strength off of two-handers, but it'll probably be pretty similar. So anyway, great that it's there, but it could be cosmetic. Recklessness now generates rage. This is nice. It just smooths out the rotation, especially when you're charging with Wreck and everything. The talents that have been removed being Inner Rage, Fury Slash, Fervor, and Wrecking Ball. I don't, you know, Inner Rage was good, but it was kind of dull, whatever. Fury Slash, I'm glad this is gone. I've never liked this spell. It always just felt bad. Fervor of Battle, I'm glad this is gone. They put it in the last alpha build or whatever for Fury. I don't know. Arms already has it, and the talent's kind of whatever. And it's Fury, the Slam. I just didn't like it. It seemed like there should have been something else there, so I'm not sad to see that go. Wrecking Ball, on the other hand, I actually did like, so kind of sad to see that one go. But we've got some new toys to replace it, being Frenzy, Rampage giving us haste, stacking 3 times, and it's reset if you rampage a different target. This is basically just a more convenient version of Fury Slash to me, giving you the haste buff all the time. I like this one. Seethe, Bloodthirst generates more rage. It's good, once again. It's kind of boring, you know. I like something a little bit more thoughtful in a talent row. Obviously, you know, from a sim perspective or whatever, it could end up being really good. Cruelty, while in rage, Raging Blow deals 20% more damage and has a 30% chance to instantly reset its own cooldown. I like this. This is engaging. It does something. Frothing Berserker, this is the same thing. It does, Rampage has a chance to refund 40 rage. This could keep the rotation extremely fast if you get chain procs back to back to back, like a Ret Paladin or something with Templar's Verdict. That could be fun. Especially with Meat Cleaver here, if you get a bunch of rage back and you're like in recklessness or whatever, you could potentially just like cleave multiple rampages back to back. That could be cool. Meat Cleaver's back, being that Whirlwind deals more damage and now makes your next 4 single target melee attacks cleave instead of just 2. This is cool. Just, you know, pads out the rotation and AoE better. Onslaught got a slight buff. That's that new talent that generates some rage, does some damage. It's, you know, it's kind of like a Skull Splitter in a way. Dragon Roar cooldown has been reduced by 5 seconds. I like this because it just lines up a little bit better. And no longer reduces enemy movement speed. That's fine. It seemed kind of unnecessary to begin with. But this one now critically strikes for 3 times normal damage. Really like this change, because this reminds me of old Dragon Roar back when it first came out in Miss Pandaria. It was, you know, a really big crit all the time. So it's not a guaranteed crit, as far as I know, unless that's changing. But when it does crit, it hits really hard. So really like this change. Put some flavor back on it, especially during Recklessness, since you've got that little bit extra crit chance. Blade Storm damages have been buffed by a little bit for Fury only. I mean, 20% is pretty sizable, I guess. That's probably just to offset the balancing thing with Dragon Roar doing more damage and getting buffed as well, just so it's not a dead talent. Reckless Abandon has been really updated. Recklessness now generates 20 more rage, so it would be like 60 now, and greatly empowers Bloodthirst and Raging Blow. And Bloodthirst becomes Bloodbath. I got really excited when I saw this, but it's not the old Bloodbath. It just does 100% more damage and on a 3-second cooldown, whereas Raging Blow does 100% more damage and charges you to your target within 10 yards. I like this. This is really cool because both of these things during Rec, especially in like AoE, are going to be doing more damage, so this puts even more value on something like Meat Cleavers. You can get this increased damage benefit on multiple targets. The charge is a nice bit of flavor. This reminds me of Ascendance for Enhancement Shamans in a way, being that it turns like Storm Strike into a ranged attack. So, you know, in PvP or something, when you pop this and your target's just running away, having this extra little bit of mobility to just stay on with your cooldown up is a nice, you know, quality of life pressure thing. And it's just cool, you know, being able to spam charge things with Raging Blow. So all around, the DPS changes, I like. No complaints here. Definitely my biggest thing, I love that Deep Wounds has been changed. That's huge. And last but not least, the Protection Warrior. The Ravager has been updated to match Arms' version. It's the same thing, except it generates 10 rage. And like I said, I believe Arms' is only 7. And it states here that it's damage every 2 seconds. So I'm pretty sure the Arms one would be the same. It's just taking every, 2 seconds instead of every 1. Because otherwise, if it hit every 1 second, it would be doing a ton. You would think, anyway, unless they're just scaled up, down the damage on it dramatically. Dragon Roar is the same as Fury, which is great. Crackling Thunder now also increases the movement speed reduction of Thunderclap by 10%. Whatever, it's, makes things easier. Ignore Pain got a buff, which is nice. And last but not least, Execute has a chance to reset the cooldown of Shield Slam. This is pretty cool. Gives some nice interaction for prot during the Execute phase as well. So yeah, that covers up the new warrior changes thus far. I imagine they've already, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. They've already started data mining some of the legendary powers. There's not much right now for warriors, so we'll have to wait and see how the new legendaries actually interact with a lot of these things. But I imagine they're going to be going back and looking at some of the covenants, conduits, soulbinds, all that stuff, just to make sure all these changes really fit in, especially the, big ticket things like the mastery completely changing, because that's got to, have a dramatic impact on how things work, and maybe even sweeping strikes. If there was anything that was impacting sweeping strikes, being that Cleave is replacing it now, they're probably going to have to look into that. But yeah, overall, really happy about these changes. Cleave seems kind of odd still to me, but yeah, that's it. If you guys have any thoughts about this, I'd love to hear them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.